0147 hours, October 1st, 2025, Voronezh Oblast, Russia. Somewhere in the darkness above southwestern Russia, Ukrainian strike drones navigate through the night sky toward targets that shouldn't be vulnerable. The P-14F Lena radar station continues its endless mechanical rotation, 6 sweeps per minute, just as it has since the 1950s. Its 32-meter-wide antenna array searches for threats at ranges up to 600 kilometers, blind to the danger approaching from below its coverage envelope. Kilometers away, the Sopka-2 radar complex at Harmashivka village maintains its electronic vigil, its S-band transmitters painting the sky with invisible energy, tracking aircraft at distances up to 450 kilometers. Both systems share a singular purpose: detecting and enabling the destruction of Ukrainian drones. This is the story of how Ukrainian Special Operations Forces turned Russia's radar nodes, long assumed secure, into highly vulnerable assets. The story begins not with the strike itself, but with a fundamental miscalculation in Russian military thinking. When Moscow upgraded these radar systems specifically to counter Ukrainian UAVs, they built their strategy on a flawed premise: that traditional air defense concepts would work against an unconventional threat. The P-14F Lena radar at Buterlinovka represented this thinking perfectly. Originally designed in the 1950s to detect American bombers that would never come, it had been modernized repeatedly, each upgrade adding new capabilities to address yesterday's threats. Standing 11 meters tall with its massive rotating antenna, it embodied Soviet gigantism. Bigger was better. More power meant more capability. But Ukrainian Special Operations Forces had identified what Russian planners missed. These systems were optimized for a different war, one fought at high altitudes by fast-moving aircraft with large radar signatures. Against small drones hugging the terrain, flying slowly through ground clutter, these giants were nearly blind. The Sopka-2 complex in Harmashivka village served a different but equally critical function. As Ukrainian Special Operations Forces noted, it was an element of the continuous wall system of airspace direction finding along the border with Ukraine. This S-band radar could track aircraft at 450 kilometers, determining not just position, but nationality, friend or foe. The operation that would destroy these radars began long before the first drone launched. Ukrainian intelligence had spent months mapping Russian air defense networks, studying patterns, identifying weaknesses. They discovered something remarkable. The very predictability that made these systems reliable also made them vulnerable. The P-14F Lena followed rigid operational procedures unchanged since Soviet times. Its rotation rate, emission patterns, and maintenance schedules were as regular as clockwork. The Sopka-2 at Harmashivka operated with similar predictability, its crews following routines that prioritized efficiency over unpredictability. According to NASA fire detection data later analyzed by open-source intelligence, thermal anomalies appeared at both locations between September 29 to 30, corroborating what Ukrainian forces would announce days later. But in those dark hours, Russian operators saw nothing unusual on their screens. The drones approached from vectors the radar computers had been programmed to ignore. Too slow to be aircraft, too low to be missiles, following flight paths that resembled birds or ground vehicles more than military threats. The sophisticated filters designed to eliminate false returns were actually helping mask the approaching danger. While Ukrainian operational security prevents confirmation of exact drone specifications, the mission itself reveals crucial capabilities. These weren't hobbyist quadcopters with grenades zip-tied to their frames. These were purpose-built military systems capable of navigating hundreds of kilometers through hostile airspace and delivering precision strikes against hardened targets. The evolution was remarkable. Just months earlier, Ukrainian forces were celebrating successful strikes at 70 kilometers. Now they were operating deep inside Voronezh Oblast, demonstrating a maturation of both technology and tactics that had outpaced Russian defensive adaptation. What made these weapons particularly effective wasn't raw sophistication, but clever employment. By flying profiles that exploited known radar limitations, using terrain to mask approach routes, and timing strikes for maximum effect, Ukrainian forces turned relatively simple drones into strategic weapons. The final moments before impact revealed the fatal flaw in Russian air defense thinking. The P-14F Lena's massive antenna, capable of detecting aircraft at 600 kilometers and altitudes up to 40,000 meters, continued its rotation, its beam passing over the approaching drones without recognition. The system's 1950s-era design, despite digital upgrades, simply wasn't configured to recognize this threat profile. At Harmashivka, the Sopka-2's more modern processors were simultaneously tracking dozens of contacts, commercial flights, military patrols, weather phenomena. Its computers, programmed to prioritize fast-moving, high-altitude threats, relegated the slow-moving drone signatures to low-priority tracks. By the time operators might have noticed something unusual, it was too late. The strikes occurred nearly simultaneously, suggesting precise coordination and timing. This wasn't random harassment, but a carefully orchestrated operation designed to maximize both physical and psychological impact. When explosions rocked both installations, they shattered more than just equipment. They broke the illusion of Russian air defense invulnerability. The P-14F Lena, which had stood sentinel over Buterlinovka Air Base for decades, was reduced to twisted metal in seconds. Its massive antenna structure, suddenly unbalanced, tore itself apart in a catastrophic failure that could be heard kilometers away. The Sopka-2's destruction was equally complete. The sophisticated electronics that could determine aircraft nationality at 450 kilometers were shredded by shrapnel. Million-dollar processors became expensive scrap. The continuous wall of radar coverage along the Ukrainian border suddenly had gaps that couldn't be quickly filled. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces would later confirm what Russian commanders already knew. Both systems were completely destroyed, eliminated by the very weapons they were supposed to defeat. As dawn broke on October 1st, Russian emergency crews surveyed devastation that shouldn't have been possible. The P-14F Lena site looked like a giant had stamped on it. The massive antenna array collapsed. Control buildings gutted by fire, cables and equipment scattered across the facility. At Harmashivka, the scene was equally grim. The Sopka-2 installation, pride of the regional air defense network, was a smoking ruin. Backup systems that should have maintained some capability had failed in cascade. The sophisticated integration that linked this radar to the broader air defense network was severed. Russian commanders faced an immediate crisis. Without these radars, Buterlinovka Air Base was effectively blind to threats from the west. The gap in coverage was massive. Hundreds of kilometers of airspace were now unmonitored. Mobile radars were rushed to partially fill the void, but they lacked both the range and capability of the destroyed systems. The precision of these strikes told a story within the story. Ukrainian intelligence had achieved something remarkable: detailed understanding of Russian air defense architecture that enabled surgical strikes against critical nodes. This wasn't luck or random success, but the result of systematic intelligence gathering and analysis. Every aspect of the operation suggested deep knowledge. The timing exploited periods of reduced alertness, the approach routes threaded gaps in overlapping coverage. The targets were chosen for maximum cascading effect. Even the near-simultaneous strikes prevented mutual warning between facilities. This intelligence coup extended beyond just technical details. Ukrainian forces understood Russian operational culture, the rigidity that prioritized procedure over adaptability, the assumption that traditional threats were the only threats worth considering, the complacency that came from operating systems that had never been seriously challenged. October 3rd brought official confirmation from Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, but the strikes were part of a pattern that had been building for weeks. On September 30th, an S-400 Triumph radar in Crimea was destroyed. September 26th saw 2 coastal defense radars eliminated. September 21st brought the destruction of a 55 ZHA-6U Nebo-U mobile radar. Each strike built on the last, creating cumulative effects that went beyond individual destruction. Gaps in coverage made subsequent strikes easier. Destroyed radars couldn't provide early warning for others. Fear and uncertainty spread through Russian air defense crews who realized they might be next. The systematic nature of the campaign revealed strategic thinking. Ukraine wasn't just hitting targets of opportunity, but executing a coherent plan to blind Russian forces ahead of potential future operations. Every destroyed radar was one less sensor in an integrated network that depended on comprehensive coverage. The destruction of these radars exposed a fundamental crisis in Russian military doctrine. For decades, Soviet and Russian thinking emphasized massive, powerful systems that would dominate through technological superiority. The P-14F Lena embodied this philosophy. Its 600-kilometer range and enormous antenna were supposed to make it invulnerable through sheer capability. But warfare had evolved, while doctrine hadn't. The same characteristics that made these radars powerful, size, emissions, fixed locations, also made them vulnerable. They were designed for a war of great powers, throwing massive aerial armadas at each other, not asymmetric conflict where small drones could slip through defensive nets. The Sopka-2 represented attempted modernization, but it too fell victim to outdated thinking. Its sophisticated electronics and S-band radar were optimized for traditional threats. Against unconventional attack profiles, even modern technology failed when employed within obsolete conceptual frameworks. These strikes demonstrated how fundamentally drone warfare had changed military equations. The cost disparity was staggering. Drones worth perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars, destroying radar systems worth $200 million. But beyond economics, it was about accessibility of capability. Ukraine had achieved what would have required a major Air Force operation just years ago. Deep strikes against strategic targets, coordinated attacks on multiple facilities, precision effects against hardened installations, all accomplished with unmanned systems that risked no pilots and cost a fraction of traditional platforms. This democratization of precision strike capability had implications far beyond Ukraine. If a nation under invasion could develop such capabilities while fighting for survival, what could other countries achieve with time and resources? The monopoly on strategic attack once held by superpowers was ending. Moscow's response revealed the depth of the crisis. Initial silence gave way to minimization, then deflection. But military professionals understood what had happened. Russia's air defense network, marketed globally as the world's best, had failed catastrophically against an opponent it was specifically designed to defeat. The practical challenges were overwhelming. Russia's vast territory meant thousands of potential targets needed protection. Even if sufficient air defense systems existed, which they didn't, the mathematics of defending everything against small drones didn't work. The radars needed to detect threats were themselves vulnerable to those same threats. A circular problem with no easy solution. Attempts to adapt, increased patrols, electronic warfare, physical barriers around installations were band-aids on a fundamental vulnerability. The architecture of Russian air defense, built over decades at enormous cost, was obsolete against the new threat paradigm Ukraine had demonstrated. Beyond physical destruction, these strikes achieved devastating psychological effects. Russian radar operators, previously confident in their system's superiority, now wondered if they were sitting in death traps. The routine of military service was shattered by the knowledge that any moment might bring death from the sky. The strikes also humiliated Russian military leadership. These weren't lucky hits, but systematic destruction of core capabilities. The inability to protect critical infrastructure deep inside Russia undermined narratives about military competence and technological superiority that were central to regime legitimacy. For Ukrainian forces, the psychological boost was enormous. David had not just hit Goliath, he had blinded him. Every successful strike built confidence and momentum, proving that creative tactics and determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable disadvantages. The destruction of the P-14F Lena and Sopka-2 radars offered profound lessons for modern warfare. Traditional air defense concepts were obsolete against distributed drone threats. Expensive, sophisticated systems could be defeated by simpler, cheaper alternatives employed cleverly. Geographic depth no longer provided security in an age of long-range drones. Most fundamentally, these strikes showed that military adaptation was no longer optional but essential for survival. Forces that couldn't evolve rapidly would be destroyed by those that could. The comfortable assumptions of military superiority based on traditional metrics were deadly in an age of asymmetric innovation. When Ukrainian Special Operations Forces announced on October 3rd that they had destroyed 2 Russian air defense radars specifically designed to counter Ukrainian drones. They revealed more than just tactical success. They had demonstrated that the fundamental assumptions underlying modern air defense were obsolete. The P-14F Lena, standing sentinel since the 1950s with its 600-kilometer range and massive presence, couldn't protect itself from the very threat it was meant to defeat. The Sopka II, with its modern electronics and sophisticated capabilities, fell just as easily. Together, they represented $200 million in hardware and decades of investment reduced to scrap metal by drones worth a tiny fraction of that cost. As Russian commanders surveyed the wreckage and scrambled to fill gaps in their radar coverage, they faced an uncomfortable truth. The continuous wall of air defense they had built along the Ukrainian border was an illusion, easily penetrated by an enemy that had learned to exploit every weakness in their defensive architecture. The message from Ukraine was unmistakable. Nowhere in Russia was safe, no system was invulnerable, and the age of traditional air defense supremacy was over. In its place rose a new paradigm where creativity trumped capability, adaptation beat sophistication, and small drones could bring down giants. Given that traditional radar systems have proven vulnerable to drone attacks, which defensive investment would you prioritize? Developing AI-powered optical detection systems, creating distributed networks of smaller radars, or focusing on offensive counter-drone capabilities? Defend your position.